All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to get started with this evening's programming. My name is Annie Howard. I am the organizer for the Chicago Housing Justice League. We are so grateful that everyone is here tonight with us. Before we get started with the presentation itself, I just want to give the floor over to Irene, one of our Spanish interpreters for tonight, who can go over some of the instructions for that. Irene, go ahead. Oh, right, okay. Apologies. Sorry, this is my first time using the interpretation function during a meeting. Okay, Irene, I just turned it off for the moment. I will do screen share and show the presentation, and then we'll get turned back on.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Irene, along with my colleague Maribel, will be the interpreters tonight. So I will say this in Spanish and then in English. Buenas noches a todos, mi nombre es Irene, igual con mi colega Maribel, vamos a ser las intérpretes de esta noche. Si necesita interpretación en español y está conectado vía su computadora, debajo de una barra de herramientas aparecerá un globo que dice interpretación, es un icono de un globo y escoja español. También tiene la opción de apagar el audio original. Si está conectado por su celular o una tableta, puede ir a donde dice More o más y presionar los 3 puntos y escoger la interpretación español o inglés. Igual tiene la opción de apagar el audio original. Good evening, everyone. If you would like interpretation services to Spanish, if you're connected through your computer, you'll see the little globe that says interpretation. Click on that and choose English or Spanish. You also have the option of turning off the original audio. You're connected through a tablet or your cell phone. Click the 3 dots that say more and choose language interpretation. Again, you also have the option of turning off the original audio. And the globe will appear once the interpretation feature is back on. El globo aparecerá cuando ya esté la función encendida otra vez. Gracias. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Let me get that turned back on and then we'll get started. Okay. So like I said, my name is Annie Howard. I am one of the organizers for the Chicago Housing Justice League. We are here tonight to talk about the myth of the mom and pop landlord. This is a really important topic for us at the Chicago Housing Justice League, as we are organizing for the Just Cause for Eviction campaign. Basically, small landlords are one of the main reasons why we're told that we can't have tenant protections in Chicago. Because they'll hurt small landlords, there's something that we're not allowed to get done. With this event, we hope to challenge this narrative and show why small landlords are so critical in the fight for housing justice. Throughout 2020 and 2021, stories like these have been rampant, particularly in relation to the eviction moratoria that were put in place in 2020 and began to expire across the country in 2021. We've seen many stories raise concern about small landlords, often used as justification to end eviction protections. We know that such measures saved lives. According to one research study, the premature termination of eviction protections in more conservative states resulted in more than 10,000 additional deaths and 400,000 additional COVID cases. Despite that, this kind of media rhetoric amplified pressure against tenants just trying to stay in their homes, treating housing first and foremost as a landlord's investment and not a vital need for renters. These narratives also suggested that tenant protections were a threat to affordable housing more generally, shifting the blame for rising rents away from the real estate industry and government officials and onto the tenants that have seen housing costs skyrocket in recent decades. Yet, as these headlines from Vox and Bloomberg suggest, many of the stories we hear about landlords are misleading. Undeniably, small landlords are in a more precarious position than investor class landlords. The impact of missing payments when a property is a two-flat and a landlord lives downstairs is much different than when the risk is spread out across an entire body of investments. But as these headlines suggest, the rental market is ripe for landlord profit today. The analysis highlighted in the first article shows that landlord balances were approximately 30% higher in May 2021 than they were 2 years earlier, with deferred maintenance and mortgage payments allowing landlords to build up their assets. While these costs will need to be paid eventually, the reality is that federal rent relief money, meant to protect renters, in reality ended up back in the pockets of landlords. In some cases, we've already seen tenants use rental assistance to pay off their debts, only for a landlord to turn around and evict the tenant a month later. Paired with the legal lockouts and utility shutoffs that countless tenants have encountered over the last 2 years, renters are still at a disadvantage when their housing is dependent upon the actions of their landlord. Another piece of this discussion that's worth emphasizing is the divergent class interests of small landlords from investor class owners. As an organization, we are sympathetic to the concerns of building owners like those in Wicker Park and other neighborhoods where property values have skyrocketed in recent decades. Thanks to Chicago's broken taxation system, among the most inequitable in the country, downtown commercial properties pay far less in property taxes than they should, while gentrifying neighborhoods have seen a mismatch between the valuation of their properties with the taxes that they pay. As the top headline suggests, speculative purchasers in Los Angeles' South Central neighborhood have swept into the community, buying out single-family homes and small apartment buildings and flipping them, whether to new homeowners or as higher-priced rentals. This kind of investment is a threat to tenants and homeowners alike, making it harder for communities to remain stable and gradually improve without being turned over for profit by outsiders. And just a quick note here, in Chicago, the definition of a small landlord is owner-occupied 6 or fewer units. This will be important later as we talk about what actually is a small landlord when that definition shifts around because of the real estate industry. Finally, let's talk just briefly about how this stuff plays out in Chicago. According to a report published by DePaul University's Institute for Housing Studies last year, Chicago has lost 48,000 2-to-4 unit buildings since 2013, representing nearly 12,000 rental and owner-occupied housing units. Nearly half of those units were deconverted to single-family homes, a trend that's happened primarily in wealthy North Side neighborhoods, driven by market forces pushing to create higher income housing. Meanwhile, 1/3 of the missing units have been demolished altogether. This has happened primarily in disinvested communities on the South and West Side, the product of building owners falling behind on their mortgages and losing their homes. In both cases, the outcomes are far from ideal. Chicago loses vital low-cost housing units, renters are forced out of their homes, and class divisions between communities grow starker, as we see in this graphic on the left. Chicago's 2, 3, and 4 flats, once a great leveling force for renters and owners alike, are now a symbol of increasing disparities in housing. Without explicitly addressing the role of small landlords in the fight for housing justice, we'll continue to see our city further polarized. So that's it for my introduction. I'm going to hand it off now to our moderator for this evening, which is Adam Johnson. Adam is the co-host of Citations Needed, an exceptional podcast that I would recommend everyone check out. And I will let Adam in turn introduce all of our panelists tonight. So thank you so much. believe you're muted.
Sorry, that's embarrassing. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to all the panelists for being here and the people watching and listening at home. One small programming note, I typically have glasses, but they broke the other day. So if you see me squinting a lot, I'm not doing Zoolander Blue Steel. I just can't see. So I just want to apologize ahead of time for all my gratuitous squinting. So I'm going to lay out the set the table a little bit, and then we'll go to the actual experts here. I'm just a simple country media critic. But just some quick figures. I know that in Chicago, on average, there's over 23,000 evictions a year. So this is obviously very high stakes for a lot of working class people. Just cause eviction rules or some version of that or laws exist in some 7 states, 15 cities, including New Jersey, Massachusetts, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, D.C. I know that Chicago right now is debating it, as Annie laid out. This is working its way through the city council. The existence of so-called mom and pop and small landlords is one of the things that I know is of tremendous political consequences with respect to how we frame it and how it's framed and who the kind of harmed party is. I know that real estate lobbyists obviously oppose just cause evictions. Their website says, quote, "The just cause eviction ordinance does not protect tenants. Instead, it threatens to further burden the process of renting available housing to those in needs and adds additional cost and risk to property owners," which is, I suppose, their preferred term to landlord, already operating in expensive, highly regulated environments. More broadly, the more relevant or more interesting question from a PR perspective is this idea of how one defines a small and a mom and pop landlord, something we interrogated at great lengths on our episode about this. New York, for example, legally defines it as 10 units or fewer. The city of Los Angeles defines it as a more reasonable 5 units or fewer. The Washington Post, the media defines it differently. You'll notice the media broadens it even more when they're going out for these kind of sympathetic landlord stories. The Washington Post defined it as someone owning 20 units or less, which is getting a little more dubious. The New York Times, in one of their mom and pop landlord sob stories, wrote, quote, "The distress is so acute for so-called mom and pop landlords, those who own fewer than 10 properties, which typically have between 1 and 4 units. So theoretically, according to the New York Times, a mom and pop landlord can own 36 properties. So I think you kind of see what I'm getting at. We're starting to veer into somewhat, the definition is very malleable, I think, by design, kind of like the Supreme Court in pornography. You kind of know it when you see it. I think we can all probably agree 36 properties isn't really what we have in mind when we think mom and pop landlord. And that slippery definition, of course, has tremendous political consequences, which is one I'm super excited to get into today with the panelists and kind of talk about. We actually cited research from one of our panelists in our episode about that, so I'm excited about this. I want to start off by introducing the panelists to kind of get their impression about what the definition of small mom and pop landlord is, what the value of having a consistent definition may or may not be, and what political role actual genuinely mom and pop landlords could play in just cause and other kind of pro-tenant legislation. So I want to start off by introducing Sam Rabia, who's the data lead and engineer at Just Fix It NYC, whose research I shamelessly plagiarized on my episode. If you want to begin by introducing yourself and tell us what your shtick is, right, for a better term.
No worries. Thank you, Adam. So hi, everyone. My name is Sam Rabia. I currently work as the data lead and engineer at this organization in New York City called Just Fix NYC. And so although I'm not based in Chicago and the work that I do is not Chicago focused, I'm really happy to kind of be here with y'all and be just a representative voice of very, very similar issues that a lot of folks within the tenant movement face in New York City. And so I guess just to explain a little bit about the research that I'm kind of bringing to the table today here. So Just Fix maintains this tool called Who Owns What, which is essentially a tool that was built alongside a group of tenant organizers in New York City that tries to estimate kind of like how extensive your landlord's portfolio is. And so there's a lot of different ways that landlords will try and hide different linkages between properties that they own, whether through registering many different LLC names or through having many different spellings of their name on their registration forms. And this tool builds off of existing research from the tenant organizing movement to essentially automate this process of trying to kind of unveil all of those traps that may be laid to disguise linkages in property ownership. And so I'm going to drop the link to the tool. It's open to the public. So anyone who's familiar with any address in New York City can put that in and play around. But essentially, due to the maintenance of this tool, we had very specific access to this ability to estimate how big the typical landlord is across New York City. And this has been a question that comes up very specifically because of this common trope of the mom and pop landlord and the role that that plays within policy work and within the dominant media narrative around housing in New York City. And so this was just around the time, I want to say late 2018, early 2019, when I started my research and analysis into looking at kind of who the typical landlord is in New York City. And this was right when there was a major push within Albany and amongst a lot of different tenant organizing groups for what was later to be known as the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which was a major victory for tenant rights in New York City that was fought really hard by many groups, both around New York City and upstate. And essentially, the fight that ensued for this bill was centered around actually rolling back a lot of like Bloomberg era pro-development, pro-real estate legislation that supported, essentially incentivized kicking folks out of their homes to raise up rents. And whenever there was any claim for strong tenant protections or saying that these policies lead to displacement, there was always a very convenient narrative in centering this small mom and pop landlord as a particularly vulnerable figure if there were ever to be stronger tenant protections ensued by a new bill like this, right? And so I remember having conversations with folks from the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which works both upstate and downstate in New York, around actually trying to look not only at who the typical landlord is, but how certain pieces of legislation and how it would change would actually affect landlords, right? Tighter protections for rent stabilized tenants, is that going to affect larger landlords or smaller landlords, right? Tighter protections for folks facing increases due to repairs, is that going to affect larger landlords or smaller landlords? And so what ended up coming out through my research was a report that looked at, again, like what does the landscape look like in New York City? What does a typical landlord look like? But then actually looking at trends between landlords that own one property up to landlords that own more than 60 properties, who really has a history in evictions and owning rent-regulated apartments and filing these things called major capital improvements, which at the time allowed folks to basically create some repairs in a common space and raise tenants' rents exorbitant amounts, leading to mass displacement, right? And ultimately what the study found was that in pretty much all of these different categories, larger landlords were far more likely to be involved in these kind of processes that were going to be affected by this new Tenant Protection Act. And so while small landlords did exist, the typical landlord in New York City, a typical renter, lived in a building owned by a much larger landlord than folks are talking about. And I think what felt like the more impactful piece of the report was looking at these trends where larger landlords are far more likely to be owners of rent stabilized housing, right? Small landlords barely own rent stabilized housing at all. So if we're creating stronger tenant protections for tenants in rent stabilized units, that's much more going to be affecting the larger guys. And that very much contradicted the media narratives that we were hearing at the time. So I'm also going to drop in the report for folks to read at any time that they, that they are curious about. But I guess I'll just leave it there and just say that, this trope of the mom and pop landlord continues to come up within the fight for stronger tenant protections in New York City. And I think as far as what we can do as like data analysis to support the tenant movement, the data is there showing where these trends are and what, property ownership in New York City really looks like. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from other panelists just how this narrative and this fight has been going on.
Yeah, and just to be specific, your data found that the average New York apartment registered with the city of New York belonged, that the person's average apartment belonged in the 21 property, 893 unit portfolio. That was the average.
Correct.
Yes. Which is, again, not the average you would see in local media or CA, right? Which is, I think, the issue here, right? But not denying the existence of smaller landlords, just the fact that they make up a disproportionate of the media attention. And on that note, I want to introduce Taft West, who's a retired property manager and former board member of the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. Taft, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a brief explanation of your vector or your sort of angle into this topic, and we'll go from there.
Right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me, Andy. I spent about 40 years in real estate. Retired a couple of years ago. Most of that was in property management of all kinds. Spent a couple of years, 5 years, as director of management for a public housing authority in Rockford. Took on a portfolio from the Chicago Housing Authority. Said they were a bunch of bums when it came to handling tenants. So I managed their Southwest side scattered sites for a couple of years. Worked in market rate as well. Was involved in the development of Dearborn Park with a for-profit firm developer. Spent about 15 years in market rate doing that kind of market rate stuff. And 25 years I spent in affordable housing, managing my rehab, present-day Section 8, senior housing. And so had an opportunity to do a lot of stuff. And along the way, as a manager, one of my jobs trained the assistants who came along to manage real estate. I still quarterly teach a continuing education class at Chicago Associated Realtors. I'd say the class is probably more, I'd say 60% of the people that take this class that are landlords are market rated, and the others are, affordable, some mom and pop. I spent about 5 years with the Rents Right organization, City of Chicago. And along with that assignment, I was the hotline answerer in Chicago for the landlord tenant hotline. And so with that, I got 2,000, sometimes 3,000 calls a year from landlords. And I can tell you, these are mostly smaller landlords, a mom and pop who own 6 units, maybe 12 units. And their biggest issue for me was training. The market rate people had very smart lawyers and, were tied to the Institute of Real Estate Management. So they were all well trained. I took on a high-rise development that had over 2,000 apartments on 100 acres. And the attorney of record called the corporate office and say, this young fellow is not spending anywhere near the money we put aside for evictions. So I got a call from corporate and said, our attorney says it thinks you're making deals. I'm like, yes, of course, hell yes, I'm making deals. Isn't our goal to keep people out? They say, well, our manual, we don't make deals with tenants. I say, well, I've always believed that a sensible manager exists to make sensible exceptions to the rule. So if someone is behind on their rent and I can get them current, I'm going to do that. So I can tell you, I got a letter, sort of a disciplinary letter, but when some of the partners and owners came to this property and saw how the income was shooting through the roof, I kind of got left alone. So being a good owner and considerate of people who live there, you still make money. Actually, you make more than just focusing on the dollars. In my assignment as Director of Management of the Housing Authority of Rockford for 5 years, I came there and I asked the managers, what's the most important thing? Is it people, the paper, or is it the process? The answer to HUD. And I can tell you, we had about 8,000 units, had about 30 property managers. And so I can tell you, about 5% of them are people. So I said, let's go back to the beginning. Let me ask you another question. If none of the people were here, what would be the need of us? So people kind of looked around. I said, exactly. Let's focus on what's important. And that's what I've always done throughout my career. Excuse me. In this class I teach quarterly at the Chicago Association of Realtors, I share with the mom and pops or anybody who's interested, how to do an awful lot of things in this business. For example, we go over the landlord-tenant ordinance. We talk about maintenance, how to pick a good tenant. We talk about nuisance abatement. And these kinds of things are valuable to mom and pop landlords because, as my hotline question showed me, training and really understanding operational is really helpful for these landlords. When I work for nonprofit lenders, I work for a couple of them. And my job was to set up a class for those mom and pop developers so they would understand how to manage their building successfully. And we call it capacity building. And sharing these particular topics, for example, I have subject matter experts. We had an attorney who was an expert on the ordinance, and we gave him a copy of it, and we went through it top to bottom. We also had someone who talked about real estate taxes. We had a maintenance expert talk about how to maintain the property. We had a fair housing attorney, Bill Caruso, who has done several thousand Supreme Court cases involving fair housing. So and this was a 4-day session, 12 hours. So these owners really got a good introduction to what I thought going around the horn on critical things that you need to know in order to be a good landlord, particularly for the mom and pop. And I also shared with them disclaimers with maybe 60 forms that I used myself, as a manager and when I was training people. And I said, these are not magic. They won't work unless you do. But I was happy to share the things that helped me. And that's another problem that mom and pop landlords have, is organizing the paperwork and the paper flow when it comes to checking out a tenant, running credit reports, and also the flow of paperwork related to the maintenance, the rents, collection, and all of that kind of stuff. So my feeling is that when we talked about this just housing amendment, it's too bad in our world that we have to sort of put on paper how to do the right thing, what's right, and what to me is common sense. I read through this, and those are the things I did as a manager, as a matter of course. If you hold yourself out as managing real estate and you invite people to live there, to me it's common sense. The longer they live there, the better you're going to do in terms of your income and the stability of the property. In buildings that I manage, most of my seniors will say, I'm never leaving here. I plan to die here. I say, darling, just don't die in your apartment. But I can tell you, in my 30 plus years of on-site management, I found 22 of my seniors deceased in their unit. They just would not move. And to me, that's a compliment to how you take care of your unit, not just for the seniors, but for everybody. I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. One of the gratifying things to me after managing, really Class A market rate units was affordable housing, to prepare a unit for someone with not a lot of money or resources. And maintenance people who know me, I have a reputation for being beyond anal when it comes to prep and maintenance. So when you show someone who doesn't have a lot, their new apartment, and it's absolutely spotless, sometimes their eyes fill with tears when I say, welcome home. So that's always been my philosophy of managing. And the goal is to keep people housed. If they get behind on their rent, then we have a discussion. Anything that's out of place, the first thing I would say is go talk to the tenant. Sometimes in my classes, I say to my students, what do you do if the tenant gets behind on the rent? They say, send them a 5-day notice. I said, how about going knocking on the door and say, what's going on? Before you start sending notices and things, try to work with people as best you can. So that's all I'll say for now. And thanks for having me, Annie. Adam?
Sorry about that. Thank you. Appreciate that. Next up, Karen Pamela Alvarez is a tenant organizer with the Autonomous Tenants Union, a grassroots volunteer organization based in Albany Park here in Chicago that empowers renters facing unjust evictions and other housing issues. Karen, would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us how you view the just cause and how you engage with this particular issue.
Of course. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here. My relationship to ATU, which is an all volunteer-based organization in Albany Park, started a few years ago when I had moved into an apartment bordering Albany Park, and the house is a 2-unit house owned by just by a small landlord. It's his only property. So I responded to the ad. His ad had certain things or promises. It said that it took small pets, that laundry room was included, and other amenities like backyard, front yard. So I moved in. I went to sign the lease with my boyfriend, and only my boyfriend was asked to sign the lease, which at that point I knew nothing about tenants' rights. I would just move into an apartment, sign a lease without reading it, and just not worry and hope that I had a good landlord. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. So when we did the walkthrough, his handyman was still doing repairs, and so they promised by the first of the month when we moved in, everything would be in perfect condition. So I trusted that that would happen, and no further inspection was done. So on the day of move-in, I realized that the shower head fell off and that there were windows on the first floor that didn't have a lock and other types of things. I immediately texted the landlord and said, there's so many things wrong with the unit still, which he denied and said, no, the handyman completely fixed everything. So at this point, I had already given him security deposit for his month's rent. And so the next day, at 6 a.m, I find that my neighbor had put a door between the front and backyard, basically claiming the backyard for himself. And I called the landlord and I said, what is going on? And his reply was, if you don't like it, move out. I had been in the apartment less than 24 hours. I had already spent like $1,000 in moving fees and, just moving in, renting a truck and all of that. And for someone to just tell me move out as if it was just, I could just, flick a wand and I'll be in a new unit. So, I felt very frustrated. I didn't know what to do. Like I said, I was unaware of any type of tenants' rights. So within 10 days after that, he came to the apartment to let gas people in to connect my gas. And so he noticed that I had 2 small dogs, which he acted very surprised. And he's like, you have dogs? You shouldn't have dogs. And so I said, wait a minute, you knew about this. Your ad said small dogs allowed. And within 24 hours, I was served with a 10-day notice saying you have broken the lease. And, if you don't fix this, I can evict you. So by that point, I was basically in tears every single day, receiving text messages from him saying that I had to move out. And my mom also lived with us. We were terrified. I would go to work thinking my furniture is gonna be outside in the street and I'm gonna be homeless, even though I've paid my rent, I've paid my deposit, I've done everything right. So I called 311. I said, I am in a desperate situation. I'm about to be homeless. This man is trying to kick me out. They provided me with some numbers for organizations, and I must have called at least 50 of them before I even came across one that said, we'll help you. And that was ATU. It took me about 3 months to find that help. During these 3 months, on the first of the month, there would be a 5-day notice posted on my door and text messages from my landlord saying, you need to get out, you need to leave the apartment. When I found ATU, they were at capacity, but they said, you're very fluent in English. If you are able to lead or do most of the work in your campaign, we'll provide all the support that you need. And of course, they were the only ones that said yes. So to me, that was hopeful. And at the first meeting with ATU, I met so many other individuals that had gone through the same thing in Albany Park. And to just discover that and be in a place where I felt understood and supported, it was just a game changer. I literally had cried every single day for 3 months, not knowing what to do, thinking I'd be homeless. And so they also provided me with the legal help that I needed. They provided me with an attorney who specializes in tenants' rights, of course. And from there, I just began learning all about tenants' rights, you know, the protection that a lease gives you, that many of us sometimes don't even ask for a lease when the landlord just says, okay, well, you're going to be month to month. And we don't know what that means. I was able to legally deduct rent from my landlord for the last 6 months because he also locked me out of the laundry room, so I could not do laundry for like 6 months. So during the pandemic, I had to leave my house, go to a laundromat every week, even though that was stipulated in the initial agreement and the initial ad. And so thanks to ATU, I was able to live out the entirety of my 1-year lease. Of course, at the end of that, they explained to me that I had no right to stay in the unit because I didn't have a protection of a contract. So I started looking for another unit to move out. And I am basically still in a lawsuit with this landlord. He kept my security deposit that was never returned. He kept some of my personal belongings that were stored in that laundry room, like AC units, a vacuum cleaner, other type of things. And fortunately for me, I did find the help through ATU, and they guided me through properly documenting all of these things as evidence that are now being shown in court. And unfortunately, this landlord seems to not understand, and neither did I, about like tenants' rights and what his responsibilities are. They just collect a check, and that's no issue for them. So in court, because I was never asked to sign the lease, only my boyfriend was sort of asked to sign the lease. I thought that was discrimination. Like, why am I not being given this right, you know? And even though my name was not on the lease, and he currently claims in court that I'm not considered his tenant, he accepted the rent from my bank account every single month. So that's, you know, it doesn't make sense. If I'm not your tenant, why didn't you decline my money? They're happy to take money and make a profit from renting units that are not fit to have a safe habitable condition for the tenants, but they're cashing on checks and they're threatening with eviction. And I always think of my mom, whose primary language is not English. If she had been alone, I am sure she would have self-evicted, not knowing where to look for that help. And I know this happens. And now that I'm involved as a volunteer, I see no-fault evictions all the time, where the tenant has done nothing wrong and the tenant, the landlord will still file for eviction. And when people don't know their rights, they just self-evict. Or I see a lot of illegal lockouts still happening, a lot of utility shutoffs happening. And so I wonder if it's because of a lack of knowledge around their obligations that landlords do these things, or they just really don't care and they think it's my property, I can do whatever I want, I can violate people's rights. So with ATU, I've sort of become more and more involved in helping communities like Albany Park, and specifically those people whose primary language is not English. I like to sort of work with ATU in raising the awareness and educating both tenants and landlords as far as what to do in every situation. And especially in the winter, we see a lot of cases of landlords shutting off the heat with families that have children, that have babies, and the reality is that when they're taken to court, the fines that they face are minimum. I think one landlord paid like $500 in fines for shutting off heat for a family during the winter. And this is something that, you know, tenants, especially the good tenants, the tenants that are paying their rent, that don't destroy the property, that want to have a good relationship, they shouldn't be lacking the protection from landlord abuse. So ATU is a great organization. There are others in other neighborhoods, and I feel like, you know, the tenant movement is so important to protect these families that sometimes they don't know their rights. And, you know, lucky for me, I was able to find them. And like I said, we're continuing this work to raise awareness, to let people know that we're there to help them in the case of an eviction or any questions in regards to that, how that landlord-tenant dynamic should play out.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think, you know, it's empowering to meet other people in similar situations. That's kind of an entree to solidarity, right? You sort of have an organization where other people are also screwed over by people. Our final panelist, Bill Lamb. We have some great two-syllable names, Taft West and Bill Lamb. I like that. Is a retired teacher, member, and he is the owner of a two-flight village in Little Village. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling me your perspective about Just Cause and your experiences with the similar issues here?
Yes, thank you. A lot of difficult acts to follow in my position here. All you panelists that have gathered so much information and have so much experience. I'm very honored to be here with you. I'm a member of UNITE in Little Village, which is a multi-issue, all volunteer activist organization that does a lot of things, including eviction response. We did a lot of work with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and helping people get approved for that. We also are active in issues of police violence, for example, the death of Adam in our neighborhood this last spring, and environmental things as well, like the blowing up of the Hilco smokestack that filled our neighborhood with smoke, etc. I also am active in a group called Lift the Ban, which many of you may have heard about, which is an issue, a group fighting for 5% annual limit on rent increases in the state of Illinois. And their standard for a small landlord at this point in the legislation that they proposed is that it be 12 units or less, not necessarily owner occupied, and that the rental units that they had to be below the median rental in that particular area, as that was our criteria for that to get some special treatment as a small landlord. I myself have a 3-flat. I did not go out looking for to become a landlord, but my wife and I had already been living in this neighborhood for 6 years, and now we've been in this house for 34 years. We want to be living in Little Village, and when our family was about to get bigger, we looked for a bigger place and found this one. And as a lot of people know, so much housing is 2 and 3 flats in the Chicago area that, you know, even if you want a single family home, it's very hard to find. And we're not at all unhappy that we got a 3-flat, but that's how I became a landlord. And I've learned a lot about it, of course, in the ensuing years. Our tenant on the 1 floor moved in childless, and now their daughter is about to graduate from college. So I also haven't had a lot of turnover, which certainly is one of the goals of being a good landlord, in my opinion, is that you are helping others have stable living situations. And that's what I see in the Just Cause criteria that we're promoting today, is a chance for tenants to have more longevity in a particular unit and not be forced to move for unjust reasons or capricious reasons. And so I'm very glad to be a part of this movement here in the city of Chicago.
Thank you so much for that. Obviously, a ton of themes that we've touched on. I want to start off by, I mean, obviously, there's sort of nothing in the world more intimate than where one lives. Right? It's sort of the most important thing, second maybe to eating. And I know, Karen, you touched on this idea of cutting off gas, things like that. Obviously, during winter, that's really important. So the stakes couldn't be higher. Evictions are very traumatic, and you have this power asymmetry where one party has massive power over the other, and the other doesn't really have any power at all, other than withholding money. But for 95% of the time, the withholding of that money is not the equivalent of a child not having heat, right? So the stakes are very high. And I think that you touched on the sort of capriciousness of kicking people out. That's what Just Cause is trying to do. It's trying to create a little more stability. In the places I know that it exists, it does create that kind of stability. And that peace of mind is a really important part of this dynamic. Now, I know in a perfect world, there would just be really high quality free housing for everybody, and there wouldn't really need to be landlords, right? Effectively, we've at least from my own personal ideological perspective, we've monetized an industry that doesn't necessarily need to be monetized. This is kind of the kind of socialist perspective. But obviously, we live in the United States, so that ain't going to happen anytime soon. Which leads us to the sort of issue of what's a better way of doing it. And I want to start with you, Sam. I know that you've done this research and tried to pick apart some of these myths. So I guess my question to you would be, to start off with, Sam, how would you define mom and pop? Do you find that distinction meaningful? Obviously, it's a spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum, you got some hipster white guy at NYU who moves into an African-American woman who's owned a building for 50 years and then starts complaining how he's oppressed. Maybe that's not going to build a lot of sympathy, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have what I think is most people's experience with landlords, which is very contentious, hostile, constantly gouging you, reflexively denying any repairs at all, always reflexively blaming the tenant for every little thing. In your experience, how would you define mom and pop landlord? And even if you could define it, is that a meaningful political distinction in terms of can a meaningful amount of small landlords be part of a coalition, a Just Cause coalition, or should we sort of stick to more kind of strict Maoist interpretations of landlords, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Adam. It's really, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because I think that's one criticism that we received of the report that we did, in that our distinctions and different brackets that we devised together around what sort of small, medium, and large mean are pretty arbitrary. And I think what came about that was that there really isn't one scientific surefire way to define what a small landlord is. And I think that in New York City, I think at least in the spaces that I've interacted with, it actually has, at least in my perspective, been pretty rare to meet folks like you, Bill, who are really fighting for these kind of pro-tenant legislations. I remember when I was coordinating with Annie about this panel, I was with the rest of my team, we were curious, so what benefit do landlords see in supporting a bill like Just Cause, right? And so, for me, I think that, I think that a lot of what the report brought about, and a lot of the kind of ways that it has been used, movement I brought about over the past couple of years, is that a lot of times, just the idea of having, just the idea of owning property and owning more than one or two buildings does incentivize you towards displacement, especially when there are these business models where you can start to make more and more money every time you kick somebody out. And sort of pre-2019, that's exactly kind of what was baked into law in New York State, was that if, there were certain, factors there was this thing called a vacancy bonus, where you could raise rent 20% every time someone left. And then something called vacancy decontrol, where if you hit a certain threshold, it was about $2,500 at some point. Any apartment that had any rent regulation all of a sudden was free market. And so, I think when working with sort of the tenant groups that I'm familiar with and that I work alongside in New York, I feel like it's rarely been the topic of trying to think about what exactly is a small landlord, and more just thinking about what are the ways that property ownership is abused, right? How are the ways that property owners are incentivized to enact displacement and in that way violence on their tenants? And I think in those ways, I think that those kinds of trends we saw much more often occurred when landlords were these larger corporations versus smaller landlords. And I think that's why it was important to pull out those trends. But I think for us, I think we're much more focused on the ways that property ownership was being abused rather than actually trying to kind of separate out like sort of like good or bad or small or large, right? I think a lot of folks would describe it as more of a systemic issue of how property owners like interact with policy rather than just like this categorization of different people.
Yeah, because I think it's obviously the law has all kinds of arbitrary distinctions, right? You can suddenly drink at 21, you can rent a car at 25. There's kind of this we have to draw a line somewhere. It's just the nature of the beast, right? And I think what makes this panel interesting, and I think to Annie's great credit and her organization's great credit, is they're trying to sort of they politically you hit this roadblock where you ignore the issue of the actual mom and pop landlord, especially minority landlords in a lot of these places, and you can't just sort of say, well, screw them all, whatever, let's just bulldoze over them, that this is a political reality. So this leads to the urgent question, which I'm going to throw to Bill, if you wouldn't mind, Bill. Why should a small landlord support just cause? Is it one of these things where if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide situations? What is there actual political, is there a space for a political coalition that does include genuine kind of mom and pop landlords who had tenants for 20 years and aren't just sitting around, twiddling their mustache and counting their money?
That's the big question, Adam. And it's not an easy one to answer by any means. But I think that one thing that distinguishes small landlords, besides the criteria of how much housing they own, is their degree of commitment to the neighborhood in which the housing is. And usually, if you're a small landlord, you're often resident in that same neighborhood where you own your properties.
You have skin in the game, right?
Right, you have skin in the game, and you may have your neighbors, you may have your family resident close by, you may have been raised in this community, and you have some investment in that community and the people who are there being able to stay there. And so you have this investment in stability and affordability for the people there, because I don't want to lose money on my rental unit, but I also, don't want to lose the neighbors I've had and the relationships we've developed. And, I raised my kids here and their friends, they have friends here and so forth. I don't want to be part of breaking that up. And so I'm more community oriented. And therefore, I think it's possible for there to be terms where a landlord can afford to maintain a unit or several units in good condition, good habitability, and still have a decent rent that's affordable for people in their community. My wife was doing a meeting with some tenants just last week, and the building had changed hands, and her rent had gone up $300 at one whack. That's what we don't want, and that's what the idea of rent control laws are. But that's also, I don't know what you call it, predatory landlording, and it's motivated to destroy a community and flip a community, which is beginning to happen in Little Village. It happened to our neighbors in Pilsen much more so.
Oh yeah.
It's a long list of neighborhoods in Chicago where that has happened and is happening. And So we don't want the new people, the big property owners, to come in and simply just see us as a source of income for their investment and have no real sense of the people, human beings who have rights and concerns and a community they want to be a part of.
Right, because you live there, so you have an incentive, right? Taft, I want you to follow up on that because I know that it seems that given your history, your pedigree, it would seem strange to, I think, some people that you would support Just Cause, or at least I think Just Cause principles. But you make the argument that, or rather, I think you've made the argument that these are good for the industry as a whole, especially low-income housing. I assume they create some kind of stability. And so the distinction is maybe one of short-term investment versus long-term investment. Because if I'm just looking to flip and kick everybody out, obviously I have a different set of incentives than someone who's trying to build an actual community. So can you talk about how you approach this in your work? Obviously, Just Cause exists in other cities. How you perceive it, and whether or not you think it's ultimately in the best interest of smaller landlords.
Well, thanks, Adam. Bill made a great point, and my feeling is that he hit the nail on the head of how I've always felt about the difference between what we call mom and pop, if you will, to the bigger landlords. The people who live in the community have investment in the community, and of course they want to make a living. They want this to operate in the black. They don't necessarily just want to make as much money as possible. That's not their goal. I worked with a group in Pilsen, and Pilsen had some challenges. And there was a group of about 10 folks, and 3 of them were educators who had to move because they could no longer afford the rent, and they were pretty bitter about it. So one of the things that the nonprofit I worked with did was they financed co-ops. So I suggested, along with another community organization, how about finding something perhaps in the neighborhood that you can need some work, and perhaps we can be your partner in the financing of this unit. You form your own co-op and stay in the community. And they thought it was a great idea. So they found the building, and it was a 12 unit. And the owner had lived there for, gosh, I think they said 25 years or so. And so they explained to him why they wanted to buy it. And he said, well, tell me more about this co-op concept, And when they explained it to him, he said, how about if I find a way to sell you the building, I could stay on as one of the cooperative owners. And so that's what happened. And this group actually has formed their website and the organization. And the University of Chicago helped us tutor these folk about all the ins and outs of what co-ops are about, how to set them up, and and all that kind of stuff. And so this group is doing really, really well. So I agree with Bill 100%. The biggest difference, of course, I think the mom and pop certainly own fewer units, and they are more invested in the community, and they are more concerned about stability. People who are strictly maybe venture capitalists or folks that just want to make a lot of money, that's not what they're about. Some of the people in Pilsen will share with us, and we worked on this co-op idea, how much they were being offered for their properties. I mean, it was just some incredible sums, and some of them would not sell. And of course, there are always people that will sell. But I think we have to push for this after listening to Karen, Pamela Alvarez's story. That is horrendous. One of the things that I tried to do in the past is try to get landlords and tenants together, and let's talk about how we can work together. So I would get a copy of it, just a typical lease, and blow it up and say, landlords, your responsibilities, I would consider tenants' rights, and tenants, your rights, or landlord responsibilities. And so working together is what this thing is all about, if it's to work. And so as we read through this lease, sometimes both sides would be a little surprised at how this thing could work together, so that it was successful. I start out by asking the question, landlords, when I say the word tenant, what comes to mind? And they will say sketchy, avoiding paying rent, not neat and clean, that won't obey the rules. And so I said, okay, very good. Let me ask the tenants. When I say the word landlord, what comes to mind? 99% slumlord, unapproachable, arbitrary, those kind of things, skimps on maintenance. So those are the kind of things there. So I said, landlords, you're not well thought of by your tenants. And so how do we work together to do that? But I can't offer any more additional than what Bill laid out there. I mean, it's just fantastic.
Yeah, I think a lot about this, the kind of adage where people say, well, what about having a benevolent, billionaire? And they say, well, that's like asking for a benevolent feudal lord, where it's like, the issue is not whether or not you get lucky and have a nice landlord. I think we've all had experiences with good landlords. I've had more with that, probably bad anecdotally. I think the issue is one of political power and one of leverage over people, is that whether or not that should be a system that exists at all. So in that sense, it's ultimately a political question. So I want to throw to Karen in the work that ATU does. Obviously, you had a bad experience with a mom and pop landlord. I just got out of a horrible lease with a mom and pop landlord. So if I seem a little bitter, that's probably why. And I think that so the issue is like, so then there's the political question of whether or not, I mean, again, I know this is maybe big picture stuff, but like whether or not we should be in a position where we're basically at the whim of the caprice of someone to be nice, which doesn't seem like a very tenable political solution. Obviously, just cause helps this, because then you're not at the caprice of someone to be nice. They're kind of made to be nice. Can you talk about the work that ATU has done specifically to convince people on the city council in Chicago about the sort of stakes and why it's important and why we can't just kind of rely on landlords being nice people?
Yeah, definitely, Adam. So we get a large volume of calls every single day in our hotline asking for help from the neighborhood. Many of the times, like Taft said, we are able to sort of sit in the middle and mediate. Sometimes that's not the case, especially with the larger landlords that sort of do this for profit. And I think that's opposite to the type of landlord that Bill is, who is someone who is invested in the community. These other large corporations come in and they just do it for the profit. And they're monetizing on people's lives, on people's safety. And just as I believe that landlords are in a privileged position, right? When you own a property, whether it's 1, 2, or 3, you're put in a position of power, of privilege. And I think that there should be a minimum of expectation and rules that landlords should play by. There's at the moment no limit on rent increases that can be done. So if someone wants to increase a rent by hundreds of dollars, they can do so. The tenants have no protection, and we're seeing this on a daily basis. In Chicago, ATU has one very recently, a pain where a developer took over a building in Albany Park and was trying to displace 7 families, gave them a 30-day notice. They didn't offer any relocation assistance, anything, just you have 30 days to get out. And obviously they were lucky enough to find ATU, and we started a campaign. We helped them. Of course, this was done with or through direct action, by bringing the media in, by doing a large social media campaign against the actions of the landlord. And how unfortunate that we have to take it to that extent for us to see sort of like change and a little bit of humanity shown by the landlord. And after a 9-month struggle, and because obviously like the media was involved, the landlord's name was put on several newspapers. There was a press conference right outside of his house. That's when they were like, all right, well, let's sit down and talk, right? But not, they didn't think through, or they didn't like touch their hearts when they delivered 7 families with children with a 30-day notice, and they had children of their own. This is a family, you know, who lives here in Chicago too, who has children of their own, and all they care about is profits at the end of the day. So I think that there should be a minimum, I mean, there's the RLTO, but I think that should be more enforced and spread statewide, because I do work with other organizations outside of Cook County that help tenants in Will County, DuPage County, Lake County, and the RLTO is not something that gives them the protection there. So I feel like statewide, we just need better regulations to protect tenants. I'm like I said, any landlord is sort of like at the privileged position, and we can't just trust that everyone's going to be like Bill, who is invested in the community, who wants to do better, who is a good human. You know, that rarely happens. So I think that we need more regulations and better protection for tenants.
Just to clarify for listeners who don't know, the RLTO is the residential landlord and tenant
Ordinance.
ordinance, and that involves what? Can you sort of explain that real quick?
Of course. So that sort of is like the rule book for tenant and landlord dynamic, right? What should be done, the repairs that should be addressed in a timely manner. How long does the landlord have to respond to issues? Or for instance, the fact that the landlord has to give a 48-hour written notice before entering a unit. The fact is that a lot of landlords, and we see this every day in our phone calls, there's tenants who say, my landlord comes in at their will whenever they want to. And that's not something that should be happening, you know. So that is what the RLTO, unfortunately, it only applies to Cook County. So people outside of Cook County don't have that protection. It also, one of the rules is that 14-day notice that tenants can deliver to the landlord saying these are the repairs that I need. Otherwise, I'm entitled to deducting some rent or withholding it until you do these repairs. So the RLTO, like I said, is only applicable in Cook County at the moment.
Yeah, I want to ask you real quick, because I want to be clear. We established the stakes both in terms of the class distinctions and the racial implications of the power asymmetry with landlords and tenants. From your organizing, obviously, a lot of people don't have English as a first language. Obviously, there are certain obligations around, or rather, one would assume there are certain obligations around having legal documents in multiple languages, having sort of an understanding what the rights are. You mentioned that a lot of people have no freaking clue what the rights are. And that it's not, and at no point is it incumbent upon landlords to make them, there's no Miranda rights for a version of tenant rights where they have to tell you, right? Can you talk about your experiences fielding those questions and what just cause would do to help that situation? I know this is not a panacea, but presumably would give some layer of protection.
Definitely. So I feel like the protection that it would give is that sort of like no fault eviction to tenants. So landlords are only allowed to increase a certain percentage of rent to the tenants, and that wouldn't cause that mass displacement that we're talking about, because that is one of the things that we see happening. Tenants just their lease expiring, and then the landlord does a huge rent increase. Of course, the intentions behind is not to renew the leases, hoping that they'll leave so that they can then flip the property and do a major increase.
Right. I want to talk a bit about transparency and opacity by design. Again, Sam, I want to shoot this one to you. I know this is your area of expertise. I don't think a lot of questions are about a lack of data, but I do think in this case, a lack of transparency in data does kind of inform the political discussion a lot. You had mentioned that even people who have a relationship with their landlord, they think they're smaller than they are. Obviously, every landlord in the history of mankind cries poverty. If you've talked to any landlord, you would think they were just barely scraping by. Much like bosses, when you ask for raises, no matter what, it doesn't matter if you work at IBM and or Apple Computer. Rapport. I want to talk about the opacity. I know you don't have a lot of experience with Chicago, but I know that to the extent to which you've had more, you've built the tools to get more transparency in New York. Is that something that we could transfer over to cities like Chicago or even Wichita, Kansas, or any other place? Like, how does having a better sense of the connections and the scope of one's landlord and how many properties are, how can that help politically? Obviously, it can lead to tenant unions that are across buildings, right? Because you can do rent strikes and such if you have a sense of who your enemy is. You know, back in the old days when you were in a coal mine, you knew who your boss was, but now maybe they're all hiding behind these LLCs. Can you talk
Pero
about
muchos de estos se esconden en sus LLC.
And there's so much to say about this, so I'll try and not take up too much time. But
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking to what you brought up, Karen, where it's like being a landlord is being in a position of power. I think having your, you know, the level of which you own property and which properties you own and what issues tenants face in your properties, having that information be hidden from public view is a way that landlords have maintained and upheld their power. And I think we see that in New York City where, you know, given the very opaque and broken ways that landlords will kind of create different trails behind their property ownership, that can take away power from folks who are actually trying to like stand up for their rights and also connect with others who are facing similar issues. And so that's why I think, one, it's such a common issue across localities outside of New York City for this question of, you know, how big is my landlord? That question seems to be really hard to ask no matter where you are, right? And it's been really amazing to talk with groups actually in Chicago and throughout the country who are working with tenant groups who are facing that same level of opacity when it comes to actually trying to investigate what kind of landlords are dealing with. And so in that way, I think that there is so much power that can kind of be redistributed once you're actually able to pierce through that veil and see, okay, this is exactly who I'm dealing with, right? One really quick anecdote I can bring up is that during, you know, during the pandemic, when a lot of tenants were unable to pay rent, or there were also organized rent strikes in New York City, and there was a lot of organizing around actually trying to investigate how much money landlords have and how big of a hit that they could take. Because during that time, it seemed like every landlord was trying to claim that they didn't have any access to money and resources in order to continue to maintain their buildings during the pandemic. And I think being able to actually map out, okay, you're not actually who you say you are, and you actually have all of this money sitting everywhere. That gave a lot of power to folks who were organizing those rent strikes to be like, hey, like, we know you have the money to take a hit right now, right? And so I think when it comes to access to data, it's all about building power for the movement. And so I think that's why it's been really amazing that while there is this, like, it seems like this widespread problem when it comes to access to this information around landlords, I've also seen so many different tools and methods and folks organizing around these different tools pop up across the country. I would just like to name, so I know that a similar tool to the tool I work on in New York City and we work on at Just Fix, there is a tool called Find My Landlord, which is run by the Chicago DSA and does a very similar thing of actually trying to unveil all of the different connections that certain property has in Chicago. I've seen many other examples, and I've been in touch with a lot of those groups across the country. And so I think the more that we can hold our like government institutions accountable to actually doing the work of making that accessible to the public, I think the more power these groups will have in actually being able to stand up for their rights and really get a strong sense of the kind of landlord they're dealing with.
Yeah, because it's baked into the cake, the power asymmetry, but the information asymmetry, right? When I apply for an apartment, I don't ask for 5 references from my landlord. I don't ask for their financials. I don't get to, you know, stick a telescope up their bank account like they get to do to us. Or in New York now, I mean, that was a certain point where it was like, you know, 7 months rent. Also, you know, I need the bank account of your sister-in-law and that guy you knew Bill in college. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? Whereas that's never asked of the landlord, even though theoretically you're both taking a risk. And of course, in many ways, the tenant is taking more risk because they have less resources. They have less lawyers, less money, etc. Did we want to ask some questions of the audience, Annie, or
Yeah, it looks
rather
like
have the questions?
we have
from
one
audience?
from Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, Sam, how exactly did you figure out how much profit landlords were making?
That's a great question. So I will say that JustFix is not the only group that does this kind of analysis. There's many other organizations and volunteers from New York City who do this kind of data analysis. So at a very basic level, we're kind of able to estimate how much a portfolio costed a certain landlord, given that we're really lucky and we have access to like property records. So we can look back at the deed of the building when it was last sold and see how much money the landlord bought it for. I think there's also a lot of analysis folks do actually looking into mortgages and other like sort of financial documents that landlords have, filed with like banks and lenders that they're working with. I think that can be even a more accurate way of estimating how much money they have. But to be honest, I think we're really lucky in that there is a lot of data that there is public access to. So there's a lot of different ways that if you're willing to dive into the resource and you have the resources yourself to, do that, there are methods that you can use to estimate, okay, these are these pots of money that a landlord has access to right now.
Are there efforts from real estate lobbyists and landlord organizations in New York to create more opacity to try to get rid of some of that online information? I'm sort of curious because I thought there would be sort of an Empire Strikes Back situation.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a long history of like the fight for open data in New York City, and I think there's certain like sources of data that we yet have access to, given that there's so many different stakeholders fight over like levels of protection for that. I will say that I think more so the reaction that I see from the real estate industry is less about actually trying to keep things covered and more just trying to find ways to deny and to obscure the actual findings that we find. So, we'll often hear, oh, well, like we have a different method of estimating property, the number of properties we have, and we have a different method of counting our evictions, and we have a different method of like estimating a net worth. And I think when we do have to rely on the labor of these grassroots movements to do the data analysis, it always comes under so much more scrutiny. Mm-hmm. And then it always feels like a very easy cop-out answer to just be like, oh, well, the data is wrong. And unfortunately, when we don't have when it's not coming from an official source like the mayor, the governor's office, sometimes it can be a struggle to like really hold that like level of that level of like legibility and like of legitimacy that I think people expect. And so it always feels like even though we put so much work into doing such an accurate job doing this data work, we still keep fighting this narrative of like what's the sort of official right approach to this.
Right. Okay. Do we have any more questions, or should I ask my own questions?
Yeah, we got one from Brandon, and I apologize now, Brandon. I realize I can call on you, but anyways, your question is, well, first one was, are there estimates of what percentage of units in Chicago are owned by landlords that would fall under some reasonable definition of a small landlord? So as I mentioned earlier, in the event, a small landlord in Chicago is 6 or fewer units and also owner occupied. That's really important. So it could be over the span of like 2 different buildings, like a 2-flat and a 4-flat. Okay. We have some estimates of this from the census data. I unfortunately don't have that off the top of my head right now. What I will say is that I was writing an op-ed on behalf of Just Cause for the Sun-Times because they published some sort of misleading information about it. And they were insisting that the numbers were as high as 60, 70, even 80% in small landlord buildings. First of all, they would not define for me what their definition of small landlord was. I don't necessarily think it was 6 or fewer units. And I also just don't, I think without having a rental registry, which is something that we would include in the Just Cause bill, it's really hard to say whether or not that's even accurate. You get a rough estimate with census data and other data that exists, but it's hard to really be clear about that. And I think there's also a misconception that just because a 2-flat exists or a 3-flat doesn't mean that it's owned by a single owner, right? Like those buildings are getting bought up and targeted by real estate investors as well. So you can look at a 2-flat and you can assume that it's owned by a small landlord, but that's not necessarily true. So
Yeah.
I think without having the real estate, without having the rental registry that we would be putting in place with Just Cause, we're really at a disadvantage for that kind of information. But
And of course, there's two different distinctions. There's what percentage of total landlords are quote unquote small landlords, and what percentage of units are owned by small landlords, which are totally different questions, right? Whereas the former will be much greater than the latter, because obviously by definition, larger landlords will own more units, which is why I thought the way Sam phrased it as data about the odds of you as the average tenant, the odds that your landlord will own X is actually a more sort of politically interesting question. And does that make sense? Because that's something I came across in our research for our episode. There was very little data about this. We had to sort of go off some of the stuff that activists have done. And I think when really important existential political questions are done by, you know, some DSA guy on a computer, you're like, well, should there be a person involved? Like he was like higher up with the suit who went to Harvard? I don't know. Anyway, the stuff is very much reliant on activists. And of course, the real estate industry has its own numbers that they pretty much just pull out of their ass. We had more questions, I believe.
yes, there's 2 in the Q&A if you want to look at those.
Yes, Paul John Cook. Are there examples of mom and pop landlords joining to organize with tenants to collectively build a tenants union, not only at their current residence, but also buildings that power within their surrounding communities to truly have wins and widespread rent control? If so, what do these examples or movements look like? So I guess the question is, are there examples of smaller landlords? Because obviously there's a class distinction between tenant and landlord, regardless of the size of the landlord. But I would venture to guess that within the context of landlords, there is legitimate political tension between bigger real estate interests and smaller landlords, is I guess the question asking. So to what extent will the interest of the small landlord and the tenant overlap? And is there examples of them having a sort of actual political coalition around this issue? So I guess that's a question for whoever wants to answer it.
I was going to say, I feel like, Bill, can you talk a little bit more about the work that you do with UNETE and how that structure has worked to fight for stability in Little Village?
Yeah, but I certainly don't have a direct answer to the question that was being asked. There are models that are small in our area, like the Resurrection Project in Pilsen, for example, and other groups trying to organize housing cooperatives or other kind of collective ownership models. But I really don't have a lot of information to share with that. What we do is we attempt to work with landlords who are sympathetic with their tenants, and it's kind of on an individual level. For example, with the emergency rental assistance program, again, we were able to find some landlords who were really quite sympathetic for the position of their tenants and not interested in evicting them, and interested in helping them be able to catch up on their rent. Those kind of people are out there. Not large experiences of people advocating for collective ownership schemes.
Okay, there's another question here from anonymous attendee, very strange name. This is a question and comment. It seems like people invested in their communities in this approach are helping folks get housed. How many community invested in properties? How many community invested properties were found in this research? And you can help me dissect that a little bit. I have bad vision. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a good answer for that, because I also don't know like what research sort of specifically being mentioned. I mean, I guess I will just say there are examples of more community-focused housing. And actually, we're going to be hosting an event about social housing that the Justice League will be hosting next month. So a plug for that, March 10th, where we'll talk about ways in which the United States has so few examples of housing that is decommodified, that is not trying to profit. There are tools that you can look up, sort of like, for example, the Community Land Trust is one tool where the goal is not to consistently be making more and more money off of housing, but to keep it affordable into
Whoa,
the
whoa,
indefinite
whoa.
future.
It's crazy talk. Why would you not? You don't make money off it. What's the point then? I have a question for Annie and Karen, if y'all wouldn't mind, and whoever else, I suppose. What is the current political status of Just Cause in Chicago? I know it's been somewhere in the ether in the city council for over a year now. What are we talking here? If I'm doing prop bets in Vegas, what are the odds here by end of year?
I can field that one. So yeah, so I've been organizing with the Justice League for about a year now, and we've been, overall, the league has been working on Just Cause since late 2019. Originally, we thought we were working on it in partnership with the city because Mayor Lori Lightfoot said that she was interested in the bill, and then we learned that she did not know what she was talking about, which is not the first time that has happened, unfortunately. As of now, we have 14 co-sponsors in city council out of 50 total, so we need to effectively double the number of people on our side to get it passed, which sounds like a lot, and it definitely is. But if we can get sort of like 15 through 19 or 20 secured, I think the rest of them will be a little bit easier. This is going to be an interesting year for Just Cause between the upcoming elections in 2023 in Chicago, as well as yet another budget season, which always seems to bring out a lot of just intensity in city council. We're hopeful that fighting for this bill both is something that it will bring in revenue, because the rental registry helps to pay for other housing initiatives and brings in upwards of like $40 million, as well as the very real fear that a lot of people are going to be feeling about not getting reelected if they're feeling the pressure from challengers will convince some people to sign on to the bill. That is obviously to be seen, and we have a lot of organizing work to do, which is why when we're wrapping up here, I'll invite folks to another meeting to kind of keep learning more about what we're doing. But the odds are often against us, as we know, in fighting for things that are actually good for people. Just as a sort of reference point, the Just Cause bill that was passed in the state of Washington, I want to say, or Oregon, one of the two a couple years ago, took them 6 years to get passed. So the fact that we're only on year 3 right now is to our credit. So hopefully we won't take that long, but that's about where it is right now.
Well, as G. Stewart said, lost causes are the only causes worth fighting for. With that, on that note, I have to exit, unfortunately. Is there anything else I can do for you before I go, or for y'all? I'm not trying to be Hollywood. I just have a hard out. I have to record my own show in about 10 minutes.
No, I think we can wrap up there. I can continue fielding questions for a few more minutes, and then we can wrap up in just a little bit longer. Adam, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for being a great moderator.
Thanks, y'all. This was really informative. Thanks so much, y'all. I appreciate it so much.
Even the cuss words.
I cuss? I tried
just
not to.
Just once.
Well, just once. Okay, you're keeping track. All right, yeah. Well, my baby's asleep, so it's okay. You know, it's after hours. All right, y'all. Have a good night.
Cheers.
All right, well, we'll wrap up in a moment. Everyone else, if we can stay for just a few more minutes, if that's all right. Trying to think if there's any more questions in the chat that we can answer before we go. Yeah, so I mean, part of why, so Brandon has another question. What are some of the other pieces of the narrative around small landlords that make it politically difficult to do anything that would supposedly hurt them? Like their kids' college tuition is tied up in the investment or something like that. I guess that's a question. Well, it's so easy to forget too that like tenants are also trying to save up and kind of keep their lives going. They're paying rent every month and not seeing that investment go anywhere. And that feels like something that often gets lost in that narrative when people are talking about where the money is going, right? I don't know, does anyone have anything else to kind of follow up with that? I mean, just the costs, like Karen, you were mentioning the cost that you were facing moving into a place and then immediately being told that you were having to potentially move out, and like how much that was going to cost you. So can you maybe talk a little bit about like the tenants that you've worked with and the costs that they face if they're faced with a move unexpectedly, and how that affects them?
Absolutely, Annie. I mean, I think that displacement can cost a lot of money, from moving expenses to really having to relocate your children from school district in the middle of the year. Many of these times, and your lease expires, and for people, there's not like a specific month, right? If the landlord decides to evict you during the middle of the winter, what do you do then? We have to consider the cost of finding a new unit, application fees, putting down security deposit, and hoping that the landlord overall will return that security deposit that you entrusted them to keep for you, which is a huge issue that I myself have faced. And we see so many landlords not following the proper guidelines when it comes to security deposit, and that within itself can be a whole nother discussion that could take hours. Around the regulations from security deposits. But yes, displacing families is something that comes with a lot of cost, and it's just very expensive. And that is something that, you know, landlords should offer some type of relocation fees when they're displacing a family, whether it's a couple of months of rent or something, right? And at the end of the day, a lot of these huge landlords are just doing it for the profit. So they don't have the community in their best interest. They don't have these families. They don't care if they have small children living in these units. So all of these factors play a huge role. And of course, there's that emotional impact that you can't really put a price on. You know, like I said, for me, the first 3 months when being served with notice after notice had me devastated. I was extremely depressed, and I don't think there's a price that my former landlord could ever pay. Just, you know, and the whole idea behind me going into this lawsuit with him is so that I understand that my security deposit might be lost, but I want him to be a better landlord for his future tenants. I don't want anybody else being displaced by him, and especially without knowing their rights, just like it was my case. And I was fortunate enough to find ATU and learn and become so involved. But there's a lot of people that still don't know their rights.
Bill, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that, Annie, if I might.
Yes, let's get, and then Bill after that.
Okay, Karen is exactly right. The biggest issue, a friend of mine who spent 50 years in landlord-tenant law, he will teach this ordinance in my class, would say handling of security deposit is one of the biggest errors in the state of Illinois. You've got 45 days generally to get it back, and only 30 if you're going to withhold. When I got to be a general manager, was training managers, and I would say to them, you know, I'm very anal about getting people's money back. I timed myself within 5 days they had it, and in a lot of cases, I knew they were going to move out, and I handed them their check and a hug and wished them luck in their new home. Sometimes you can't do it in 5 days, but if you're doing quarterly inspections, I didn't get into all of that, but if you're doing quarterly visits to make sure everything is okay in the unit, the people that should live there are the only ones living there. If there's some small maintenance that needs to be done. So generally, when someone gives notice they're going to move, if you've been taking care of the place, you have an idea of what condition it's in. So it shouldn't take you 45 days to get their security deposit back to them, plus the interest. So it would be nice if that were part of the just housing thing, that landlords do a better job on getting security deposits back, because people need their money.
Great. Bill, do you want to still chime in?
Sure, I will. You know, there's been a lot of talk over the recent years about the importance of wealth accumulation for people to move out of poverty or low income situations and be able to establish themselves better materially in this capitalist nation we have. And So there's a lot of emphasis on teaching people how to handle their money well. But also becoming a small landlord is an example of someone doing that, where they've taken some of their wealth and have the ability to manage that money and acquire property and then can charge rent for it, which is, capitalism 101 for them. And it depends on your politics, partly what you think about capitalism, no matter at what level, how you start to view a small landlord. To me, their size can make them still human. And these sort of things that Mr. West talked about, teaching landlords how to behave with tenants and be humane and have a human relationship there, is so important to the difference of the anonymity of the large landlord who doesn't give a damn. And that's a very difficult thing to quantify. But I think it's extremely politically important because there are such small landlords and they have a different interest in terms of whose side they're on in their own minds.
Great. Thank you, Bill. I would love to keep this conversation going all night, but in respect to our panelists' generous time and also just because I know that people do need to go do other things, I want to wrap up the discussion for this evening. Also, we lost our moderator, so there's a good reason to wrap up. I will conclude tonight with just sharing a little bit more information about what the Justice League is doing and how you can stay involved in Just Cause. So we have a petition link. Many of you might have already signed that, and that's where you learned about this event. But if you have not signed the petition already, we have that at tinyurl.com/justcausechicago. You can also find that on our website, which is justcausechicago.org. And so, yeah, signing that will give you, basically it'll add your name to our email list where I send out emails kind of updating you on what we're working on. So I would love to be able to get more signatures on there. I also want to note that we have a meeting on February 26th, which is next Saturday at 10 a.m., which is going to be our general membership meeting. This is also available to the public at large. And so we'll be talking about Just Cause. We'll be talking about rental relief funds for people that are dealing with, still dealing with backlogs of rent and want to be able to access that and kind of what the state of that policy is. And we'll also be talking about right to counsel in eviction court, which would be a policy to make sure that if you're in eviction court and you're a renter, you have the resources to be able to fight your case. So there's a pilot program for that in Chicago, and we'll be discussing that a little bit further. So if you'd like to learn more about what we do in the Justice League and generally get some more resources like the ones that we shared tonight, you can find that registration link at tinyurl.com/CHJLFebmeeting. So you can see that there. Otherwise, I have recorded tonight's event, so that will be downloaded soon and then posted online for people to watch later if you want to share this with other people that might find it interesting. And I will be following up with everybody who attended tonight with all of this information. So if you don't write it down right now, you'll be hearing from me soon enough anyways. With that, again, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. Thank you to everybody for participating tonight. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and I think we had an incredible conversation. Thank you to Sam for joining us from New York, and to Karen, Taft, Bill, and our moderator, Adam, for tuning in from Chicago, and to Irene and Maribel for translating into Spanish for us. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. See you, Bill, Karen, Sam, and Annie. See y'all. Back to my coffee. Good night, Bill.